Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the online presentation of the research results of Project Target. Project Target is a research project co-funded by the Internal Security Fund of the European Commission, and it aims to improve our understanding of the dynamics of gun violence across Europe and the impact of illicit firearms trafficking on gun violence. And with this project, we aim to contribute to the implementation of the new EU Action Plan on Firearms Trafficking. Now, in the past 2 years, the Flemish Peace Institute, together with the Leiden University, explored the links between different types of firearms trafficking and different types of gun violence in all EU member states and in the Western Balkans. Now, during this project, we regularly exchange information with Europol, the Dutch National Police, UNDP CSEC, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drugs Addiction. We analyzed available data in 34 European countries and undertook 7 in-depth country studies to better understand the dynamics of gun violence across Europe. I'm very grateful that we were able to work with some partners also for conducting these in-depth country studies. Very happy that we were able to collaborate with Archibus Solutions, the University of Warmia and Mazuri in Olsztyn, and the Victimology Society of Serbia. Now, we also talked to a lot of national experts during our project, and we're very grateful that we were able to have this really good exchange and close interaction between the researchers on the one hand and the practitioners, because we feel it really paid off. Now, in this online event, Dennis van den Awele, researcher at the Flemish Peace Institute, will present our findings on the scope and the characteristics of gun violence in Europe. This presentation will be followed by a reflection on the key findings regarding gun violence by Marieke Liem of Leiden University. And then in the second part of this event, Richard Martens from the Dutch National Police and I will try to focus on the impact of firearms trafficking on violence in Europe and the different challenges and opportunities lying ahead of us in the fight against firearms trafficking. Fee Beliagre from the European Commission will provide us with some closing remarks. Now, please note that every panelist is very much open to your questions. You can pass them on to us by using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If a question pops up by another participant and you find it relevant, please, you can always use the thumbs up symbol to upvote this question so we know that these questions deserve priority in answering. Now, Dennis van den Awele, welcome. You co-authored this report. Could you please guide us through the findings on gun violence in Europe?
Thank you, Niels, for your introduction. I'll just share my screen now. I hope all of you can see the presentation. So as Niels mentioned, I will focus on the component of gun violence in the European Union from 2000 onwards. And Niels will focus on the aspect of firearm trafficking and how firearm trafficking impacts gun violence. When we speak of gun violence in the context of Project Target, I feel it's important to clarify that we are speaking of 2 things. First, we have lethal gun violence. Lethal gun violence we take to be homicide, so both manslaughter and murder. And we are excluding cases of accidental killing, suicide, or justified killing. But we're not just speaking of lethal firearm violence, we're also speaking of non-lethal firearm violence, which in many respects is under-researched and we don't know quite a lot about. And for Project Target, we looked at 3 specific forms of non-lethal firearm violence, which is injuries, threats, so where a firearm is used but not shot, and no injury, which is an occasion where a firearm is shot, but it does not cause an injury. So these are the 2 main things we're looking at, and we're trying to figure out what's the state and characteristics of those in the EU. When it comes then to non-lethal firearm violence, I'm showing you a lot of information in this graph. I have some good news to share, namely that lethal gun violence has been in a decreasing trend ever since 2000. So it's well established that in the 1990s, European rates of gun violence, especially lethal gun violence, peaked. And after 2000, because of a myriad of factors, it has started to decline. This is very noticeable just from the size of the little bars. The orange bars represent the rates closest to the year 2000, and the blue bars represent the rates closest to now. For some countries, that's 2014. Some, we have more recent information. And you can readily notice that most of the blue bars are significantly shorter than the orange bars. One that really sticks out is Estonia, which started from the highest rate in Europe to its lowest rate. There's barely any lethal firearm violence in Estonia. But you'll also notice at the top of this slide that there's Cyprus and Malta, where the rates are either leveled or have increased, but these are not as significant since these are rather small countries and very few firearm homicides can have a significant impact on rates. And it also depends a lot on what year of reference you're using, so these are not very informative. What is more informative is the third country you'll notice on this graph, which is Sweden, which has experienced a significant rise in lethal gun violence. And we'll be able to speak about that a little bit more later on. What we also notice when we look at the data is that, generally speaking, the component part or percentage of female firearm victims has increased. This is most evident from the countries you see here. So the dark blue lines are the percentages closest to today, and the light blue lines are the percentages closest to 2000. And you'll notice that in these countries, some more significantly than others, the percentage of female victims has increased. When we look at the data, we notice that it's not the actual rates of female victims or the absolute numbers that have increased. It's actually the case that the rate of male firearm victims has decreased very strongly, while the rate of female firearm victims has remained leveled or decreased not quite as strongly as the male rate. This suggests in itself that while firearm violence in the criminal sphere, where usually men are victimized, has decreased more impressively than firearm violence in the domestic sphere, where typically women are more prone to be victimized. We'll be able to return to that in a few minutes. When you put the information that I just showed you on a map, you notice that the higher rates of firearm homicides are usually focused around the Western Balkan areas, Sweden being the exception, Latvia as well, but that Europe, generally speaking, has fairly low rates of lethal firearm violence. So even the high rates, 0.5, are comparatively speaking globally not that very high. When we put this information in the context of the total amount of murders, so any mechanism that is used for murder, if we put that into context, we get the following map. So countries in the green or blue have below 20% of their murders being committed by a firearm, so less than 1 in 5. The orange ones have between 20 and 40%, and the red ones have over 40% of murders being committed by a firearm. So you notice that firearm usage in homicide is the most extensive in the Tyrrhenic and Adriatic Sea area, but also in Portugal, the Netherlands, and Sweden, where you notice that firearms are used more often than in most other EU member states. Just to put this into context, the global average for firearm use in homicide is around 40%, which means that only the red ones are above that global average. So generally speaking, Europe has relatively low usage of firearms in homicides. Oh, something went wrong in this slide. When we just want to summarize the scope of lethal firearm violence, we notice that in 2014, Europe has relatively low levels. So we have an average rate of about 0.2 firearm homicides per 100,000 of the population, and only 1 in 5 homicides are being committed by firearms. There are some very significant differences between member states, from barely any in Estonia to fairly high usage in, for instance, Sweden and the Netherlands. If we compare it to the USA, we find that around that time frame, the rate of firearm homicides fluctuates somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 per 100,000, and about 2/3 of homicides are being committed by firearms. So the US is well above the global average, while the EU is well below the global average. We also note that there is a general downward trend from 2000 and 2014 in the EU, and if we include the UK and the Western Balkans, we count about between 1,627 and 2,263 firearm homicides in 2000. So the span, there's a section of unknowns in our data, which decreased or about halved really in 2014 to between 791 and 1,356. Given that the population in Europe has increased during that time frame, the rates have decreased even more impressively. But what is more, perhaps more important for our current purposes, is that that decreasing trend has generally stagnated since 2012. So for the countries where we have data and good data after 2012, we notice that the rates have generally leveled at sometimes a low plateau or sometimes a slightly higher plateau. In some countries, for instance, the Netherlands, you can see some impressive fluctuations after 2012. And in a number of countries like Sweden, you can see the rates rising again. So this signals that something happens in the 2010s that in some manner or form is changing that general downward trajectory in Europe. Now, this is a global phenomenon that usually until 2010, homicide rates drop globally, but there is a sort of leveling plateau after 2010. But when we then try to figure out what happened after 2012, we find out that it's not really a matter of firearm availability. What I mean to say is that police services, law enforcement services are reporting to us that especially criminals seem to have access to firearms. Both armed robbers, people in the drug milieu, and other types of violent crime have access to firearms, but are not very prone to use them lethally. In some way, it is probably believed that lethal firearm violence draws too much unwanted attention. So we find that actually the vast majority of firearm usage in the criminal sphere is non-lethal and comprises of something like firearm threats and firearm injuries. This was very hard to gather this information since there are no centralized databases for the EU that talk about non-lethal firearm violence. We only have national registration systems, but our data does suggest, and you can read about it more in the report, that non-lethal firearm violence is significantly higher than lethal firearm violence, that there are significant differences between member states from very high levels to very low levels, sometimes unbelievably low levels, and that it operates very differently in different contexts. Just firearm violence generally happens very differently. While in the domestic sphere, you'll find that firearm usage is very often very injurious and very lethal. In the criminal sphere, the vast majority, often over 90% of firearm usages, is firearm threats, mostly in the context of armed robberies. So while firearm letalities have not increased impressively, we notice that firearm usage in the especially criminal sphere has been generally increasing or fluctuating since 2010. What kind of firearms are being then used in these occasions? Well, this was quite difficult to gather. We tried first to consult the WHO database, the detailed mortality database, to find out what types of firearms are generally used in homicides. But this was actually a rather problematic database because we found information for 30 countries, 30 European countries, and in 21 out of those 30 countries, 50% of cases of lethal firearm violence, of homicide, was unknown whether a long gun or a short gun was used. So this is a sort of bare minimum for information. And in the majority of cases, almost, so 21 out of 30 countries have over half unknown. For my own country, Belgium, 92% of cases of firearm homicide are unknown, whether it's a long gun or a short gun. You can very cautiously assume from the data we do have, so taking into account that large set of unknowns, that handguns tend to be preferred in homicide, maybe except with countries that have a very significant hunting culture, where you might find more long gun usage, and UK and Ireland, who have very strong restrictions on handguns, might also explain why more long guns tend to be used. But again, this data is to be taken very cautiously. From our in-depth studies, we can actually gather some more information. I'll just share the information with you now. It's discussed in far more detail in our report. you'll find that the blue is always, so this is the image you should get, the dark blue is always shotguns. And you find that handguns in shootings are almost always the majority of shootings. So that includes pistols and revolvers. But that in lethal violence, as you can see in Spain, you can see it's not a roughly equal split, but there is something more of an equal split between shotgun and long guns, which is the case because we believe, in cases of domestic violence, where roughly half of the firearm homicides happen in Spain, there is significantly more long gun usage because those are the type of guns that are available in the context of domestic violence. Often those are hunting rifles and so on. In non-lethal violence, both in Spain, the Netherlands, as well in Belgium, and in most of the other countries we've investigated, we find significantly more shotguns because they are used predominantly in armed robberies, which makes sense. They're small, often very reliable, easy to conceal, lightweight, so they have all those sort of benefits. When we then sort of try to figure out a little bit more about the guns that are being used, we have some very detailed information about shootings in Stockholm between 2015 and 19. And in that respect, we can say a little bit about the brands of firearms that are being used. When it comes to pistols, we see that there's quite a few of Zastava, which is former Yugoslavian pistols, which are believed to be smuggled from the former conflict areas to Sweden using traditional smuggling methods. But we also find a good number of Czechoslovakian pistols and also a good number of Glock pistols, which are very difficult to come by, but they are treated with a significant status by criminals. And we often find that the Glock pistols that criminals own are not necessarily Glock pistols. They can be converted gas pistols that are rebranded as Glock pistols. So it's quite difficult to figure out how many of these Glocks, for instance, are actually Glock pistols. When we look at automatic guns being used in the context of shootings in Stockholm, we notice that the Serbian producer Zastava is even more dominant. About 2/3 of shootings with automatic guns are being done by the Zastava M70, but we also a significant amount of Scorpion guns, which tend to be reactivated firearms. We see also a few other firearms that are probably going to be reactivated or smuggled into Stockholm because the local market for automatic guns in Stockholm was not very well supplied. So we believe most of these are smuggled over the years. We also notice a significant amount of other firearms being used, predominantly converted gas weapons, which tend to be, we don't have types and brands on these, but we believe that they are probably Turkish gas pistols that are converted, usually of Zoraki brand. We notice that these are quite often found in the possession of especially armed robbers in Stockholm. When ballistics analysis was done on these firearms, we find that 40% of them are used more than once. So this suggests that they are tied to a criminal network where firearms are used quite often, repeatedly. While in domestic firearm violence, we find that guns are not always repeat use. When we compare the data to the Netherlands, we find of the same time frame, 2015-2019, we find that Glocks are responsible for 1 in 5 shootings, and Zastava are responsible for 1 in 10 shootings. So we get a fairly similar image. So the sort of same strategies are being used for bringing firearms into Stockholm are also apparently the same firearms that are being used to bring firearms to the Netherlands. We can compare this to data we have from the Armed Violence Monitoring Platform for the Western Balkans, where you also see that handguns are quite dominant. You see a somewhat lower percentage of rifles and shotguns, quite high percentage, 10% of shootings occur with automatic firearms, which seem to be more available in those countries, and a fairly small amount of gas pistols. But then again, some of these gas pistols are rebranded, and we're not quite sure how many might be included in under handguns. We also looked at firearm locations, and very briefly, I can say that we found consistently that criminal firearm violence tend to be heavily focused in metropolitan areas and often in certain regions of countries. In metropolitan areas, this is especially true for Sweden and the Netherlands, where sometimes more than 80% of firearm violence happens in those major cities. You also notice a lot of firearm violence happening in the border area between the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, an area that is known to be quite heavy on drug trafficking. And we also find that gun violence in Spain, for instance, is very focused in the south, which is also known to be very heavy on gun trafficking. I'll just illustrate that with a little map of Spain. This map shows you the levels of gun possession in Spain. Green very low, yellow slightly higher, orange higher, red highest. If we put the map of violent crime, which are mostly robberies, so gun crime, you see that's heavily focused in the south and the eastern coastal areas, which are known to be heavy in drug trafficking. So we find that criminal gun violence doesn't really follow legal possession of guns, but more is focused in certain areas. That's why trafficking plays a huge role in facilitating criminal gun violence, because it doesn't follow legal possession. When it comes to domestic gun violence, but I won't say too much about that, we notice that it's spread more in accordance with the availability of guns in a certain region. When we look at the age and gender of victims of firearm violence, we notice that if we compare data from Spain and the Netherlands, you'll see readily that there's a significant peak of homicide victims, firearm homicide victims with young men. So men between 20 and 40 are most likely to be victimized by firearm homicide. After men pass the age of 40, their chances of being killed by a firearm decreases significantly, while roughly speaking, women have generally the same risk of being victimized by a firearm, usually in a domestic context, throughout their lives. But it's also very apparent, and we can gather this information, for instance, from our in-depth study of the Netherlands, that is, as regards the consequences of a firearm incident becoming less severe. So most severe is obviously homicide, then injury, then threat. We notice that the repetition of gender and age becomes somewhat less divergent. So there's always mostly young men that are the victims, but in injuries and threats, their age repetition and gender repetition are generally slightly more even. What we found is that gun violence works very differently according to different contexts. And one of the most important contexts for our purposes, because we're trying to tie this to trafficking, is the criminal context. And we noticed that most criminal groups, especially very well established criminal groups, have decided since the late 90s and 2000s to exercise more restraint when it comes to firearm use. Firearms draw too much unwanted attention, so they organize who gets to operate a firearm and when a firearm is used, which shows impressive decreases in criminal firearm violence in countries like Italy and Estonia. In countries where you would have more loosely organized or very unorganized or very poorly organized criminal groups, such as some of the groups in Sweden and the Netherlands, they will be more prone to use firearms. They will use firearm violence often as a sort of currency for power and status, and that might easily get out of hand. We also notice in the criminal sphere that firearms are used very differently during armed robberies and the drug context. While armed robberies, usually firearms are used in 95% of the time, often just for threats and very few injuries and even fewer letalities. In the drug context, we find that firearms are often more injurious and quite often lethal. And we also find that the firearms that are being used in the drug context tend to be of a higher quality. Or even automatic firearms, military-grade firearms, can be found in the criminal context. Just a few months ago, 5 Kalashnikov-type rifles were seized in a drug bust here in Belgium. Next to this, you have a specific form, obviously, of criminal gun violence, which is terrorist gun violence. We find that terrorists tend to prefer to use automatic and semi-automatic firearms. They do not always have access to those firearms, which shows that the illicit firearms market in the EU is very closed. But when they do have access to them, often through criminal connections, we find that firearm violence by terrorists tends to be highly lethal. Just to give you one illustration, in 2020, there were about 54 terrorist events in the EU. Only 2 of those included firearms. but they did cause 14 out of 21 lethal victims of terrorist attacks in the EU. And I need not mention the 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris or the terrorist shooting in Norway in the early 2010s, which were highly lethal events. So when terrorists get their hands on firearms, they are particularly lethal. The domestic context, which Marieke will talk about in more detail in a few minutes, we find is not as strongly connected to trafficking, but more strongly connected to firearm availability, which is also why more long guns appear in domestic firearm violence. But we do find that when firearms are used in domestic context, they tend to be very more injurious and lethal than most other kinds of weapons that can be used in domestic context. And that in domestic context, you'll find a higher percentage of lethal casualties with firearm usage than in the criminal context. So this is also a context to be wary about. The report also deals with a number of other contexts of firearm usage, which I won't go into detail now, but if you're interested, it's all in the report, namely nightlife violence, violence by and against the police, firearm usage by vigilantes, school shootings, and mental illness, or firearms being used by those who are mentally ill. So a general takeaway from this is that context is an important determining factor for firearm use, and that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to the problem of gun violence, that you need to address it in the context in which it emerges. Speaking of those contexts, we did find that in Europe there have been a number of public mass shootings which occur in these contexts, and in these public mass shootings, it's often the case that because they're so high profile, we get a lot more information about the firearm that is used, how the firearm was acquired, whether it was held legally or illegally. And so we can really trace the gun and see some of the things we found for Project Target being sort of exemplified in these shootings. So out of the 41 shootings we found that 11 occur in the domestic context. They usually start in the domestic context, but then expand beyond it. 12 very lethal ones happen in the terrorist context, and there are a few other contexts, very importantly, connected to mental illness, 4 school shootings, 2 in Germany, 2 in Finland, and only 1 connected to, explicitly connected to organized crime. So this is generally speaking the image we get from firearm violence in the EU after 2000. There's a lot more information obviously in the report, and the general takeaway should be that firearms might not be as lethal as they were in the 90s. They are still being used and they cause harm in many ways. And it's very important to get a clear view of the scope of it, the characteristics of it, the context in which these events of firearm violence happen, so that we can stop the violence from happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, for your very insightful presentation. As I already mentioned, we collaborated intensively with the University of Leiden for this project, and Professor Marieke Liem was closely involved. So Marieke, I would like to offer you the floor, because I'm very sure that you have some very interesting reflections to share with us.
Thank you very much, Niels, and thank you, Dennis, for this elaborate presentation. Let me start sharing my screen. I hope that you can all see this. Yes, Niels, just give me the thumbs up. Wonderful. So welcome once again. My name is Marieke Liem, and I'm a professor of violence and interventions at Leiden University. And the credits are not just mine, definitely not. Katharina Krusselman, who conducted this research on together with the Flemish Peace Institute, should definitely also be applauded. So over the last 2 years, we took part in this exciting project, and because our expertise really lies in the area of violence, it will not be surprising that I will also zoom in on the notion of firearm violence. Now, we as criminologists, we frequently talk about the tip of the iceberg, right? We regard drug seizures, for example, as a tip of the iceberg of underlying drug crime and underlying drug market activity. Also, we consider, for example, the detection of a child pornography ring as a tip of the iceberg of underlying child pornography. In other words, we like to use this analogy, this tip of the iceberg. Now, we can also apply this tip of the iceberg when it comes to firearm violence and firearm homicide. And in this context, firearm homicide is regarded as a tip of the iceberg of underlying firearm violence. Now, why do we do that as criminologists, but also as policymakers? Is that firearm violence, and Dennis already alluded to this, is also largely a dark phenomenon. It's plagued by a dark number, i.e. we don't really know how much is going on, but also by a dark nature, right? So in general, as compared to firearm homicide, firearm violence tends to be much less clearly reported. When it comes to firearm homicide, the outcome is what we call dichotomous. It is a 0 or a 1. So one is dead or alive. So it makes it very well measurable, internationally speaking. So this is why oftentimes, because a homicide is likely to be uncovered, it's likely to be processed through the criminal justice system. This is why we tend to use firearm homicide as an indicator of underlying firearm crime, firearm violence. And it is very attractive to use this analogy, right? Again, because firearm violence is ridden by dark numbers, and dark nature. So it's attractive to use this analogy, but is it really the wise thing to do? Well, here we run into some difficulties. Firearm violence, and this is what our project has shown, it consists of many, many different aspects. It ranges from threats to injuries to shootings without hitting anyone. It consists of physical abuse, breaches of public order, and so on and so forth. So firearm homicide, our project shows, in the EU is mostly centered around domestic homicide, that is intimate partner homicide, and to a lesser extent, child homicide, homicide of other family members, and criminal homicide. So we have those two major types. And Dennis already alluded also to other types, such as terrorism, somewhat smaller, also homicide by people suffering from a mental illness, also somewhat smaller. But the major chunks really consist of domestic homicides and criminal homicides. So this already shows is that firearm homicide is not a monolithic group. It consists of different parts. What I intend to show with this iceberg analogy is that it is a mixed bag, right? We cannot speak of firearm violence as monolithic. No, it consists of many different parts. And also, it appears to be that we cannot speak of firearm violence as a monolithic construct. Rather, what the findings are suggesting is that we are dealing with at least two icebergs. And again, there's smaller icebergs, if you will, consisting of terrorism, homicide by people suffering from a mental illness, and fights getting out of hand. But in general, the large gist is consisting of two types, namely criminal homicides and domestic homicides. And when we compare these, groups, they are not necessarily alike. Rather, what we are seeing is that domestic homicide and domestic violence have a clearly different etiology compared to criminal homicide and criminal violence. So if we are to really understand what is going on, we are to focus on the setting in which such violence occurs. And again, Dennis already alluded to this. Criminal firearm violence is concentrated by and large, particularly if you look at the Netherlands and Sweden, in major cities, whereas domestic firearm violence is distributed much more evenly. So this implies that both phenomena, they need different intervention strategies. There's no one size fits all, right? So again, we seem to be dealing with two different icebergs here. And that require separate approaches and separate intervention and prevention strategies to melt each of them down. Now, the findings from our project, they indicate that criminal violence and criminal homicides on the left-hand side, they are mostly committed by handguns, but increasingly also by semi-automatic weapons, and they are related to illegal firearm possession and firearm trafficking, but also increasingly to Flaubert guns, other types of converted weapons, and looking forward, perhaps also more 3D printed guns. So this is a very large scope and a large variety of guns, firearms. And also, as our project has shown, is that criminals using these guns, particularly in Northern and Western Europe, think of the Netherlands, think of Sweden, they can really be picky, right? They don't need to settle for old Soviet guns, but there are many, many guns on the market, and they don't have to settle for less. So they can really pick and choose. Now, our project, on the other hand, shows that domestic firearm homicides and domestic firearm violence are really associated with long guns, right? Oftentimes linked to cultural traditions of hunting. So oftentimes hunting rifles and sports guns. And these are already in the domestic setting when the event takes place. So when the non-lethal or lethal event takes place. So in other words, we have two separate icebergs, and at least two separate approaches then are needed to curb the types of violence that occurs in each. And that is not to say, however, that they do not share any commonalities at all. That they have nothing in common. I believe the common factor here lies in easy access that lowers the threshold for using guns. And many students of mine oftentimes ask me, if there's no guns, people will find another way of hurting each other. And research actually repetitively shows that this only holds for a very, very small proportion, right? So-called waterbed effect. If you press down on one means, another will rise. We see that very limited, in a very limited way. What we do find is that with equal intent, the injuries sustained by firearms are far more lethal than injuries sustained with another mechanism, for example, knives or physical weapons. So at the same time, we see that firearms lower the threshold of actually committing violent acts. So it can act as what former US President Ronald Reagan once termed the great equalizer. And this is particularly relevant when we consider criminal disputes that turn deadly, but also domestic disputes that may turn deadly simply because the gun is there. So access to guns, and particularly easy access to guns, makes people use them and use them deadly. So if we are to prevent and curb firearm violence, that is non-lethal firearm violence as well as lethal firearm violence, we are to look at two separate tracks and approach prevention strategies through the setting. So that is, look at the criminal setting, criminal violence on the one hand, domestic violence, domestic homicide on the other. And then we can see that firearm violence by criminal groups and individuals may be curbed by looking at legal loopholes, as our project has shown, right? By zooming in on illegal firearms trafficking, by firearms conversion. Whereas on the other hand, domestic firearm homicides and domestic firearm violence, those types of prevention efforts should much more be geared towards curbing private firearm possession and private firearm storage. Again, I think Project Target has perhaps raised more questions than answering them, but I believe that there's clear ways forward in order to tackle this phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you, Marieke, for your very interesting reflections on Project Target and for highlighting the differences that we've seen between the different contexts of violence. What is also very interesting to see is how our two countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, are quite similar, and that drugs seems to play a very important role in that. I was wondering if I could ask both of you a question on that specifically, is that in recent years, we've seen a lot of these drug liquidations in our countries. Maybe what do you see happening in the next few years? with that regard? I'll start with you, Marike, and then I can let Dennis answer as well.
There's several hypotheses that are going on, but maybe, yeah, there's at least two. Well, I would say three. One is going up, one is remaining stable, and the other one is going down. But maybe just briefly reflect as to what is going on. I mean, you are right, there have been recent events that have really been in the spotlight. But I'd like to dispute, though, that this is necessarily a new phenomenon. So we have seen criminal homicides over the year. We have seen a relatively stable, if not a slight uptick in this trend. And this is perhaps surprising because we find other types of homicide having gone down, virtually all types of homicide. That includes domestic homicide, dispute homicide, homicides that result from robberies. So we may also question, why are these types of criminal homicides so immune? Why do the societal factors that bring down these other types of homicide, why do they not affect criminal homicides? And one of the answers, I believe, and I think you already gave this, lies in the increasing popularity of both Antwerp and Rotterdam as the ports of influx for drugs. And in addition to that, we see that not only is the cocaine market currently booming, also we see an increasingly popularity of synthetic drugs, and the Netherlands and Belgium, to a lesser extent Poland and Czech Republic, playing a key role in that. So in answer to your question, what are we expecting what are we expecting in the years ahead? There's one approach, or one hypothesis, is that the market currently is so overflown, is so drug heavy. There's so much drugs, there's so much supply, that there's new criminal groups moving into this market. And when new criminal groups move into this market, it creates a volatile situation and a hypothetically violent situation. He may argue that if bigger groups start to arise, such violence is not in their interest, and then violence would go down in a so-called pax mafiosa. I wonder whether that will be the case. And another hypothesis is that now that drug-related violence is clearly becoming a key feature in the European market, that we are able to curb some of these effects.
Thank you, Dennis. So you.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Marike has said. I think the connection between drugs and firearm violence is a very strong one in the European Union. And I just want to add, but Niels will speak about this more in a few minutes, that there's some changing dynamics in the illicit firearms market that would make it easier for certain criminals who would not usually have access to firearms to acquire firearms. And some of these include, for instance, that we see larger seizures of firearms happening occasionally, where sometimes up to 3,000 firearms are seized in one shipment, which suggests that there is potentially a profitable firearms market going on, because there's a significant demand. And while it was usually seen traditionally as high risk, low reward, that if people are willing to move large shipments of firearms to supply criminals or supply at least the illicit market with firearms, this would make the price also drop of firearms in a way, make it easier for criminals to get a hold of them, and that would sort of trigger a new arms race, especially in context with very drug-heavy trafficking. So my own forecast would be probably more on the grim side of things, but let's hope it won't come to that.
Thank you. We received another question, I think specifically more for you, Dennis, from the audience, and I'm going to read it. It was said that there is a significant subset of criminals that use firearms predominantly for intimidation rather than inducing injury. So do actual blank firing guns, non-converted blank firing guns, play a role in crime? After all, they are virtually indistinguishable from firearms. They are sometimes even legal to carry and easy to come by. Wouldn't those factors make blank firing guns attractive to petty criminals?
That's true. And what we found in our case studies is that it depends heavily on the country. Some countries will have fairly mild sentences for people who use blank firing guns. They wouldn't really consider it armed robbery if you use a blank firing gun, so a non-converted one. So criminals in that context will be less prone to convert firearms. when we found that if you're in a context with a lot of armed criminals, take for instance Sweden, criminals will be more prone to convert their firearms because they might be needed to fend off other criminals coming around. So blank firing firearms are particularly attractive in some contexts. Also, some criminals just will not know about conversion or will not be able to convert, or there might be other reasons not to convert firearms. And in many cases, especially with the Zoraki firearms, they are almost indistinguishable from some very well-known firearms that the common civilian will not be able to make the difference. So they are very attractive, especially in the context of armed robberies, but it seriously depends on the country where you'll find these blank firing weapons used.
Thank you. Marike, do you want to add something to that or not?
No, I was actually already looking at the second question, namely that of COVID-19.
Yes, then I'll go there immediately. What do you guys think about the impact of COVID-19 on gun violence?
Yeah, we really expected it to go down, right? So at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought, well, this is not only a significant blow for legal trade, this is also a significant blow for illegal trade. But the opposite appeared to be true, at least from recent stats that we found in Western Europe, in the Netherlands particularly, is that if anything is resilient, it is organized crime. So record seizures have been done in Rotterdam in terms of cocaine. There was also a record number of dismantled drug laboratories. And again, looking at the tip of the iceberg, looking at homicides in the criminal milieu, we also did not find a decrease during the COVID year. So any hypotheses with regards to to COVID having a buffering effect, we did not see that. And even internationally, for example, in the US, we see that homicide levels really went up during COVID. Question is whether this was really COVID related. Rather, studies find that it was related to the George Floyd case with increasing firearm homicide rates, both in large cities as well as in provincial cities.
But the few studies we looked at of the impact of COVID, so there hasn't been a lot of studies, especially not for the EU, but the studies we found for the Western Balkans and a few for the US showed that domestic violence has actually increased during the COVID year. And we also find that domestic violence becomes more lethal when firearms are being used. So this might be a factor in increased lethality during the COVID year, that domestic violence has spiked in a way and has also maybe then caused more casualties, but there hasn't been any comparative research on that that I know of in the EU.
Thank you both. I suggest that we have a very small break now for 10 minutes, and then we can go to the second part of our program today. So thank you all for very interesting presentations. Lots of questions are popping in as well, which I'm sure we can answer in the second part. So thank you and see you in a few minutes.
Hello again, and welcome to everybody who wasn't present during the first half of this webinar. Now, Project Target was indeed the very first in-depth study on the relationship between illicit firearms trafficking on the one hand and gun violence in Europe on the other hand. Now, what I will do now in the coming 10 to 15 minutes is actually present some of the most interesting findings that we have found about this relationship. And some of them have already been quickly mentioned by the previous speakers. But I would like to continue by sharing my screen and by showing you PowerPoint. So what do we know about the impact of firearms trafficking on gun violence in Europe? That was basically the key question. In order to answer that question, we had to first take a look at gun violence in itself, the scope and characteristics and dynamics that Dennis already presented to you. But what we always wanted to know is what types of guns are actually used in gun violence and how did the perpetrator actually acquire these guns? And if we could answer those questions, we can start analyzing the impact of firearms trafficking. Now, in order to do so, in our report, we first focused on firearms trafficking in itself. And what we did is look also at the scope and the characteristics and the recent dynamics that we have been observing. And the first question that is often asked is, how big is the problem of firearms trafficking? But the problem is that the answer is very difficult. The scope of firearms trafficking in Europe is unknown. In the past, several estimates have been made based on seizure data, but there are quite a lot of challenges with seizure data. It's often not comprehensive, not detailed or reliable, and we lack harmonized data as well for most of the countries in Europe. So that makes it very difficult to actually analyze the scope. In addition, there's always a big unknown, big dark number. So you always have to make some kind of reliable estimate. And given that the basic data is not good enough at the moment, we decided not to make such an estimate because it's just not possible to do so in a reliable way. Now, what we do notice when you analyze firearms trafficking across Europe and you look at the specific dynamics of gun violence and specifically on gun markets in Europe, is there are quite a lot of differences. There are quite a lot of differences in availability. And this is, of course, connected to the trafficking that takes place. One of the things that we do see across Europe is that criminal demand is the key driver for this trafficking. It's because criminals want to use firearms, see these firearms as instrumental goods, that they are looking for them and are actually driving the trafficking from places where there is a lot of supply of these weapons. So criminal demand is key in understanding illicit gun markets and in understanding the different dynamics of firearms trafficking in Europe. What is also very clear when you start analyzing the problem is that it is a multifaceted problem. This is a problem with many different source countries, sources, types of weapons, different modus operandi, different actors involved. It's not that simple. There are many ways in which criminals try to acquire firearms and all kinds of supply chains that have been observed. So this is also something to keep in mind when analyzing firearms trafficking and specifically the relationship with gun violence. Now, I'm going to briefly go over some of the main types. I'm not going to go into the details. If you want to know more about it, you can just read it in our report or in previous research reports that have been done on the different types of firearms trafficking in Europe. Just to mention that, of course, we still have a big problem with smuggling of conflict legacy weapons, often coming from the Western Balkans. We have still a problem with deactivated weapons and acoustic expansion weapons, whether or not they are already in a reactivated position. This was a problem that was recognized a few years ago, and important steps have been taken to solve the problem. The problem is, of course, that these weapons are already out there and they keep circulating around criminals across Europe. A similar observation with regard to blank firing weapons, converted blank firing weapons, although several steps have been taken. The problem is, of course, that these weapons are out there already and will pose a problem for many years to come. And what we see now in recent years is the focus on the Flaubert caliber weapons, so the very small calibers, 4 or 6 millimeters. But some of these weapons can also easily be converted into real live firing firearms with larger calibers. So all of these
Different types of trafficking are, of course, influencing the availability and the access of criminals to these guns. In addition, there's also online trafficking, which of course opens up a lot of opportunities as well, and so on and so on. We can keep going this for quite some time because criminals tend to be innovative and try to be inventive in trying to find ways to get their hands on guns. So what is then the impact of trafficking on gun violence? Well, an important observation that we've made is that the illicit gun markets in Europe, which are quite diverse, tend to be closed and have a closed character. What does that mean? It means that there needs to be a certain level of trust between the buyer and the seller, that you need to have certain criminal connections in order to get guns. And this seems to be eroding, at least in a couple of countries in Europe, maybe not in all, but there's definitely this pressure of eroding the traditional closed character of such markets. And we have seen throughout our analysis that firearms trafficking has a strong impact, especially on criminal violence. As I mentioned earlier, criminals are the key drivers for illicit firearms trafficking. And we've seen that this impact is quite strong, especially in situations where you see increased competition between criminals for very lucrative markets. For example, the cocaine trafficking that Marika was talking about is a very clear example. There's a lot of money to be made, and there are a lot of criminals who want to position themselves in that criminal underworld and are not afraid to use guns. And that demand for guns has actually been met with supply. Smuggling of conflict legacy weapons has been continuing for many years now. And these are, of course, very durable goods, so they remain operative for many decades, which leads to bigger and bigger quantities of these types of weapons which are becoming available. And the whole problem that we've seen in the last couple of years with reactivated guns has actually really increased that availability as well, specifically also of military-grade firearms, which were not that easily available before. There's still a minority of the types of weapons being seized, but the number is growing. And that means that criminals tend to have more access to more powerful firearms in recent years. So the supply and demand is actually being met. Now we're talking specifically also of drug criminals and other criminals who are a bit more higher up in the criminal hierarchy. But at the other hand, at the other end of the criminal hierarchy, we also see a very interesting phenomena where you see that blank firing weapons and converted blank firing weapons are actually also increasingly being used for criminal activities, specifically, for example, for armed robberies, and also specifically by petty criminals. These weapons are cheap, are easily convertible, and have been an issue for a couple of years now, making it in a situation where the different types of criminals have access to different types of weapons through illicit firearms trafficking. And this is, of course, a very clear linkage that we see between firearms trafficking and criminal violence, because we tend to see that younger and lesser experienced criminals tend to shoot their weapons much more often than the more experienced criminals. So you get into a vicious circle of violence, and you have the risk of an arms race within the criminal world, because these criminals feel unsecure within a situation where there's lots of shootings, so they want more weapons, they drive more firearms trafficking, which leads to more violence in the end. And this is, of course, quite a disturbing phenomena, because it can also have a lot of spillover effects to the rest of society, where you can see, for example, in the Netherlands, where a lawyer was executed, where a journalist was lethally shot. And this is, of course, quite a problem that the rest of society is also feeling the impact of the linkages between firearms trafficking and gun violence. And one of the linkages where we see, or the impacts that we see there, is, for example, when we talk about terrorism. Terrorist violence is something that we analyzed here as well in our report. And we know also from previous studies that criminal connections are key for most terrorists to acquire these weapons. They use often pre-existing criminal connections because these terrorists often have a criminal history themselves and are therefore able to find guns on illicit gun markets in their home country. And here we do see an interesting distinction between, on the one hand, the more jihadi extremists on the one hand, and then the right-wing extremists on the other hand, which was also one of the questions that popped up earlier during this online event. What is interesting there is that for jihadists, it's really the case that they use the criminal connections. When you look at the right-wing extremists, we also see them using criminal connections, but more often also use internet. They try to acquire weapons online, for example. And there's a real call for training with firearms. There's a real call for taking up weapons. And what is interesting is that we also tend to see that they are more often connected, for example, to armed forces or sometimes police forces. But also, for example, when you look at the issue of 3D printing, this is also something that has really been increasingly becoming important in these right-wing extremist circles. We had the 2019 attack in Halle, which was executed with a firearm which also contained some 3D printed firearms. But what was maybe even more interesting is that this manifesto that the perpetrator wrote was actually about stimulating these kinds of acts with these types of weapons. So terrorist violence is also connected to firearms trafficking. We've seen terrorists using reactivated firearms. We've seen terrorists using converted blank firing guns and so on. So if these types of trafficking occur, we can also see an impact with that type of violence. And then when you look at domestic, and this is something that was already mentioned also by Marika, the linkages with domestic violence seem to be less strong. And this is quite simply because when the perpetrator of domestic violence is looking for a gun, and it's usually a male person, he usually takes what is available to him locally. And that basically means that when we start analyzing the data, looking at specific cases, that you see that often, for example, legally held firearms are used. But when illegally held firearms are used, they're not necessarily trafficked firearms. And for example, in Serbia, we've seen a lot of incidents also with conflict legacy weapons from the same region, which are not internationally trafficked. We also see incidents with non-regularized firearms, which are available in countries. So trafficking also plays a role, but it's much less strong, the connection, than with terrorist and criminal violence. Now, what are the key challenges? First of all, the potential new source regions. In the EU neighborhood, we see quite a lot of countries and regions where there has been and still is an armed conflict going on, which means that this might actually provide opportunities for criminals later on to traffic these weapons also into the EU. I'm talking specifically about the situation in Ukraine, in North Africa, with Libya being an epicenter for firearms trafficking, but also now in the Middle East with lots of the weapons that, for example, have been proliferated in Syria, for example. So it's important to keep a good eye on what's going on in these regions as well, because they can have quite a lot of direct security consequences for the EU as well. Online trafficking, I mentioned that earlier, is also one of these challenges. It really opens up the opportunities for global trade, and especially the combination with fast parcel and postal services and these packages with components in them going across the world is something that is very difficult to detect, but becoming more and more important as well as a means to get your hands on guns. And then finally, 3D printing, which I mentioned a bit earlier as well. In recent years, we've seen an incredible technological expansion, and technology is getting so much better. It's becoming much cheaper and easier to start 3D printing. What is important there is that for a long time, we didn't see any cases of seizures of 3D printing, but until like a year and a half ago, that was the case. But in the last year and a half, we've seen seizures across Europe. We've seen seizures in the Netherlands, in France, in Finland, in the UK. So it's an indication that something is happening. And we see that both in relation to the criminal world, but also in the extremist world, where 3D printing seems to be becoming more prevalent. And this is, of course, quite an important development, because it also shows that there seems to be some challenges which might lead to easier access for those without good criminal connections to actually acquire guns. Finally, just my conclusions. What we have seen in our report is that there was a very strong downward trend in gun violence over the years, but that seems to have stopped. Lethal gun violence is the tip of the iceberg. There's much more non-lethal gun violence that also has a very important impact. The firearms misuse in these different acts of gun violence really vary between different contexts of gun violence. And firearms trafficking strongly impacts both criminal as well as terrorist gun violence, but the linkages with domestic violence are much less strong. We also see and warn about the potential spillover effects of this criminal gun violence. And what is important to keep in mind is then when you see these new challenges, well, that actually requires that actions need to be taken. And if you are confronted with a multifaceted problem, you need to have a comprehensive approach as well that can deal with these various aspects of trafficking and gun violence. And what is important there is good intelligence picture. I think that's very crucial. And I hope with our report that we have been able to contribute to that as well. Just finally, just a couple of next steps. We were hoping to actually organize this meeting in person in Brussels today. Unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, that seemed impossible. So we postpone our conference to March 2020, where we will invite many of you as well to come and join us, to participate, to discuss the findings, and also focus specifically on some of the country studies. We have very interesting country studies that were done, which we don't have the time for to go into depth in today, but we hope we can do this in person in March. At that time, we will also publish our book with all of these studies in there. And this is also maybe interesting to know, we are starting a new project next month, early 2022, a follow-up project of Target called Project Insight, in which we will develop an online platform on gun violence in Europe. It's also a project co-funded by the European Commission. And what we try to do is actually have a one-stop website where you can find information on gun violence trafficking. And then it would look a bit like this, where you would see all of the countries of the European Union. And then you could zoom in one country, for example, Belgium, and find the relevant legislation and the relevant policy documents. You can also find a link to the official governmental statistics on gun violence, but you would also have access to an incidents database that we will develop together with our partner TextGain based on media sources. So you can actually find information almost real time about incidents of gun violence in all of these countries, but also, for example, previous studies that have been done. So it would really be a knowledge base for people interested in this stuff. And this way we hope to increase our intelligence picture and make it also more comparable. So you can start finding information on specific types of incidents. For example, all incidents with female victims over the last couple of years in a number of countries. All of that information will be made available. And with that, we hope that we can actually contribute to this better intelligence picture and therefore also in trying to combat this phenomena of firearms trafficking and try to prevent gun violence specifically. If you need any more information, don't hesitate to go to our website. Our report is available, so please do so. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and give the floor to Richard Martens. Richard works for the Dutch National Police. Dutch National Police is very active in the international field with regard to the combat against firearms trafficking. And of course, the Netherlands is also a country where we know quite a lot of gun violence is taking place. So Richard, you've seen the report. We talked a lot about it in the past. Now that you have heard the conclusions, what challenges and opportunities do you see lying ahead in the field of firearms trafficking and specifically combat against this phenomenon?
Thank you, Niels, for giving me the floor. And first, I would like to thank you and also the Leiden University for their interest in this type of crime. It's much needed, in my opinion, and I would like to thank the member states who are always also part of the in-depth studies, such as Belgium, Estonia, Poland, Serbia, Spain, and Sweden, because I think that without their cooperation, these kinds of studies would not be possible. And as we all know, this specific study as Target focused on the impact of gun trafficking on gun violence in the EU. And these types of studies are certainly of great importance for law enforcement. because the results of this study allow us to address considerations at a strategic level when it comes on focusing on this type of crime. And ultimately, the goal is to offer our citizens the safest environment as possible. With these results of your target, the results of target, we can take steps in that direction. However, we're not there with this report alone. We need to get started by translating these results into work. I hope that with the help of science, like you did in Target, we're able to fight against the misuse of firearms together internationally. And this is one of the main reasons the Netherlands joined the Impact platform, for example. The National Police of the Netherlands also developed a specific international phenomenon program for 2022, in which cooperation with our international partners is described as crucial. Crucial is it because it's an international phenomenon. Firearms don't know boundaries. The Netherlands will therefore continue to be active on this theme, and we hope that we can continue to do so with all member states and other partners to join within the Impact platform, but also on a bilateral level. So for the reasons mentioned above, the Netherlands had cooperated as best as possible in the realization of this target study. In the Netherlands, for example, in 2020, 668 shootings incidents occurred. This is almost twice a day. 133 people were injured and 43 killed. That's more than 3 times a week. We were able to seize more than 3,000 firearms, real life firearms, but also almost 1,900 gas alarm weapons. So in my opinion, this is almost a no-brainer in the discussion of participating in these kinds of initiatives, thankfully supported by the European Commission and helped by the implementation of the 2020-2025 EU Action on Firearms Trafficking. We have done so by providing as much relevant data as possible. That turned out to be quite a challenge. Specific firearms data in the Netherlands is not only recorded on a minimal level, but it's also recorded in different environments. Moreover, these systems are often not able to communicate with each other, and therefore it's almost unable to serve as a basis for analyzing data. So by acknowledging this problem, the National Police of the Netherlands started some years ago by the development of a dashboard in which firearms data can be shown in an overview. Think not only about shooting incidents and their consequences, but also about seizures, which data I just mentioned. So although this is a good start, we're not there yet. Our ambition is to further develop this dashboard so that we can take more substantive data quickly available. And Target helps us by showing the importance of a good overview of nature and size, so that we'll be able to bring it to more focusing. This is crucial with the always limited law enforcement capacity available. Criminal groups make good use of the diversity of legislation in the EU. And the fact that we have free movement of goods in Europe makes transports after purchase quite easy. The free sale of Flaubert caliber and gas alarm weapons and the way they are constructed makes these weapons extremely suitable for conversion into live firearms. In the Netherlands, there are also victims quite recently after the use of these types of weapons. And Niels just mentioned one of them, which was a quite famous journalist in the Netherlands, Mr. Peter Ellevies. I think that Target made painfully clear that the process of selling, buying, and converting these kinds of weapons to firearms has limited barriers. Firearms crime has many faces. Firearms are used for suicides, but also on other violent crimes. This research has shown that there is a coherence between the availability of firearms and the crimes committed. So my wish would be that we in Europe would be able to quickly work together towards harmonization in the legislation. That we continue to make efforts to join forces in the fight against this phenomenon and the future threats, such as the misuse of 3D printers and to produce parts of firearms or even complete firearms. That we continuously inform each other about important trends and other developments, such as identifying internationally operating criminal organizations, for example. In fact, we are well organized enough to do this. So we have, for example, Impact, we have Europol, we have many other organizations involved in tackling these issues. So let's translate this target report into work, into preventive and repressive actions, not only for law enforcement, but also to involve politics, to make them aware and also to inform and invite them to be part of these activities. So thank you all, and let's go to work.
Thank you, Richard, for your enthusiasm and your ever so great will to do something about the problem. And I think what you are highlighting is very important. We're talking about international cooperation. We're talking about sustained effort in trying to get a better picture of what's going on, and then working together with all of the different actors trying to do something about it. I've received a couple of questions during our two talks. Maybe I can just give that to you as well, Richard. There has been a question about 3D printing and components of firearms have become an aspect of ghost gun issue in the United States. Is there any evidence of this with Glock components specifically also in Europe? Maybe you want to answer that one first. Yeah.
Yeah. You already mentioned it. We had some various seizures on 3D printed parts of firearms, but also about complete firearms printed by this new technology. So this is one of the great threats, and I recently told our national responsible chief commissioner in the Netherlands that terrorists in 2 years will not buy a firearm; they will buy a 3D printer. So just to pinpoint out the way we look at the problem right now.
Thank you, and maybe I can add to that as well, because there was also a question about 3D printed weapons. Actually, a question that was raised saying that to the knowledge of the person who asked the question, there were no 3D printed weapons ever used in Belgium, and how many cases were there in Europe between 2018 2021? Maybe I can try to answer that one first, and Richard, if you want to add, feel free to do so. To my knowledge, there's only one case that we have actually seen, which was the shooting in Halle in 2019. But the problem is that very often we don't know, because this type of information is often not in the statistics. It's very difficult to pinpoint that. It's even for many countries difficult to know how many murders are committed with a pistol compared to a revolver or a long gun. So the specific question about 3D is also very, very difficult to answer. What is interesting, though, is that the Belgian Federal Police actually responded in our chat by saying that there recently have been cases of 3D printed weapons in Belgium, very specific handguns. And this is also interesting when we look at the several seizures that we have found in recent years. We've seen a seizure of 3D printing workshop and dismantling of such a workshop in Finland in June 2021 in a case related to drug crime. We've seen recently the dismantling of a 3D printing workshop also in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, which was also, I think, very interesting, because what the police discovered is that there were actually 9 3D printers working at the same time, continuously producing such components. So that gives you an indication that there's a market for these types of activities. But we've also seen them in Tenerife, for example, often connected to right-wing extremism. We've seen several cases in the United Kingdom in recent months. So you feel like something is happening. And I think this is something, like you said, Richard, is something we have to keep a very close eye on to see what's going on, because the potential is incredible for criminals if they can get their hands on these types of printers and actually start producing them en masse.
but maybe you want to add something, Richard?
No, other than you're absolutely right. We have to focus on this new threat. And I guess it's just a matter of time if we'll have the first incidents, which will really actual shootings in the Netherlands with these kind of fully 3D printed weapons. So we're working on a program for 2022 to get some extra focus on this 3D printing developments, and maybe working into a big congress on this theme, hopefully together with the Impact platform possibly. But we're now in the designing stage, and hopefully it will develop into a congress next year, the second quarter of next year.
Thank you. As you know, we're also looking at this issue from the Flemish Peace Institute in close detail. It's something that we really need to do. I also have another question specifically for you, Richard. A question about the situation in the Netherlands. Is there anything to report about the sourcing of ammunition for criminal activities? Is there something that you want to raise?
That's a very good question, and I can't answer it because it's a dark number. We have, if you look at legislation in the Netherlands, as a sports shooter, you're allowed to buy or to possess 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and it's even possible to make them yourself legally. So that's a dark number. I cannot answer the question in any other way, but it's more than logical that there is a diversion from legal to illegal with ammunition, I'm for sure, but we cannot pinpoint it at this stage.
Thank you. And also from a research perspective, we know that this is understudied as well. It's very difficult to find information on the types of ammunition and where these different ammunitions actually are coming from. So this is something that I would like to call upon the research community as well, is to have more attention for this phenomena specifically. There's another question that I would like to ask you, Richard. From your point of view, will the implementation of Directive 219/69 laying down technical specifications for alarm and signal weapons, will that reduce the possibility to convert such products in real firearms?
Yes, what I already said is that if you would be able to get rid of these legal loopholes which still occur, if you look at the landscape of Europe, you will find a lot of countries which is still allowed to buy and gas and alarm weapons, and in some countries it's forbidden, or even in a category which you need a license to be able to purchase and use it. And some of these weapons are really very good lookalikes, and therefore dangerous in the hands of criminals. So it will be, I'm almost sure that it's quite easy to predict that if we will have more restrictive legislation on these type of weapons, it would help reduce crime committed with them.
Thank you for that answer. There's one more question in the chat, which I would like to raise maybe to all of the panelists, so also to Dennis and Marieke. And it's the question: what are the most important open questions concerning gun violence in Europe, and what will future research into gun violence needs to look into? So this is quite an important and open question as well. I don't know if you want to answer that one first, Richard, then I would like to give the floor to Dennis or Marieke if they want to say something.
Well, as an investigator, I'm always interested in, we have this, let's say, studies about like targets, about how it occurs, the firearms crime, how it occurs. But I would be very interested in investigations focusing on intervention techniques. So knowing what we know, what kind of interventions can we develop? And of course, legislation is one of them. So it's not only for law enforcement, but still, what kind of intervention techniques would there be possible, knowing with all these studies there are already?
Thank you for that very, very concrete suggestion. Maybe Marieke, I see you popped on your screen, so I'd like to give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And I think my contribution is really a methodological one. So I think one way to move forward in the research landscape is to recognize that firearms, they deserve a category of their own. So currently what we're experiencing, what we have experienced in studying firearm homicides, is that these are logged as homicides. And the gun then is bycatch and not necessarily registered on its own. So you really, as a researcher, really have to dig down deep. And in some countries, this is easier than in others. But I believe registration is key. So rather than considering a gun or a bullet simply bycatch in criminal investigations, registered as such, that makes it possible for research to then link specific guns to specific types of violence so that we can really get a hold on what's really going on.
Thank you, Marika. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Yes, echoing what Richard and Marika mentioned, I just want to add that it would be a great advance if we could put some research and real some policy into standardizing within the EU certain means and ways by which we register different acts of gun violence and the guns that are being used in those occasions. For instance, when we try to investigate non-lethal gun violence, these things are being registered in vastly different ways across different EU member states that these are just virtually incomparable. The information that is made available about the firearm is also very divergent, and the categories that are being used in different countries are very divergent, which makes it very difficult to get a clear grasp of these things. So one of the things we include in Project Target is a sort of wish list of things we would like to see registered after any sort of firearm incident, going from type and brand and caliber of firearm to the context in which these things, in which the event was occurred, to the relationship of perpetrator to victim, all these sort of things. If we can get a sort of uniform way of registering these, we can get a very clear image of what is going on. But to do so, I fear we need a lot more of operational capacity to really pull that through. And operational capacity means also sufficient attention to the problem. And sufficient attention to the problem means that it should be sufficiently recognized as a problem. And to do so, we need more information. So you're sort of stuck in a loophole trying to figure out what to do. So I think really better, more and more comparable data is the thing we should go for in the next coming years.
Yes, thank you, Dennis. And I would like to add to that and echo that to a certain extent. There are many things that we have been looking into in the last 2 years as part of Project Target, and that we want to delve more into. The issue of ammunition is one of them. The relationship between the different organizational status of different criminals, for example, and how the organization of the criminal landscape can play a role. The specific connection between drugs and guns. We know that drug criminals are very much interested in these types of weapons, but at the same time, we also know that firearms are often trafficked together with drugs. There is a very clear connection between these two worlds, let's say. Also looking at the domestic issue. Domestic violence, it tends to be more lethal than criminal violence. There's an interplay of different combinations that play a role, different elements that can play a role. And eventually it actually comes down to what establishing the link or finding the answer to the question, what is the link between availability on the one hand and the various aspects of availability, legal, illegal, trafficking, non-trafficking, and violence on the other hand. But in order to do so, we need better data. This is very clear. We need better data, much more reliable data, much more comparable data, as Dennis was mentioning. That's one thing. But the second thing I think is cooperation. We need to cooperate. We have complementary knowledge from the research community and from the law enforcement community, the border control community. So by working together, I think we can actually get a better intelligence picture, which is a starting point for better initiatives to be taken. And just to give you one example, there was a question raised here about 3D printing. Just by looking at the chat, we already saw that people are reporting that not only in Belgium 3D printers have been found, 3D printed firearms, but also in Romania, even in Finland, 7 submachine guns have been seized this year alone. So you see that there's a lot of knowledge that we have. We just have to pull it together and try to find different avenues for cooperation. So thank you very much for all of these questions. With this, I'm very happy that we can now also give the floor to Febe Liagre from the European Commission. Febe, welcome to our webinar. And it would be great if you could
talk about the different initiatives that the European Commission has taken with regard to combating firearms trafficking, preventing of gun violence, and also how you look back at this report of this project. So, Febe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Before delving into all the challenges and the report, etc., we would like to first thank you, thank the Flemish Peace Institute and the partners of the project for the valuable work done in increasing our knowledge about the impact of gun trafficking on gun violence in the EU. For us, research studies such as the Project Target allow us to gain further insight in this priority field. Evolutions in firearms trafficking and the type of firearms used are very important indicators supporting and actually even directing the policies of the European Commission. The Commission has recently released a report on the implementation of the Firearms Directive, which indeed discusses the same threats such as probert weapons, convertible firearms, and future threats such as 3D printing, which we talked about, or you talked about just now. Regarding 3D printing, I can concur what was said, that the amount of seizures are increasing, and we are taking a closer look at it. And for example, for us, for the Commission, we are very concerned that we have the appropriate legislation to deal with the threat of 3D printing. Furthermore, the European Commission is actually currently also reassessing the EU regulation on import, export, and transit of civilian firearms to safeguard the illicit market and to limit diversion. While assessing this regulation, we are very aware of the limitation on data. We ourselves struggle with this as well, and it is a priority for us to tackle this. In 2020, the EU adopted the Action Plan on Firearms Trafficking, which was already mentioned by our colleagues from the Netherlands. And the Action Plan actually contains 4 main priorities: safeguarding the illicit market and limiting diversion, building a better intelligence picture, increasing pressure on criminal markets, and stepping up the international cooperation. It was already discussed, but we can clearly see again in the Project Target that there is a large need for improving the intelligence picture. And we are actually a specific activity or action in the EU Action Plan is on establishing a systematic and harmonized collection of data on seizures of firearms. We already heard that this is even at a national level difficult to have a harmonized collection and registration of firearms violence incidents. So the Commission will actually support the Netherlands as an action leader for a specific operation action within Impact to organize a meeting in the first quarter of 2022 specifically on harmonizing on a harmonized collection of data on seizures of firearms. We will propose a common seizure reporting form seeking the consensus of the member states based on the illegal arms flow questionnaire of the UNODC, and we will definitely have a look at the wish list of Project Target. It is pendant to decide the way and when the member states should send the statistics to the Commission. So this is going to be for sure a difficult discussion, because obviously it has there will be capacity problems mentioned by the member states, etc. But we will very much press on the need to have this harmonized collection of data. When we have the consensus of the member state, when this data is established, we will also, of course, discuss how and to which extent we can make this data publicly available through, for example, Eurostat. But this probably will be in the mid to long term, because first, obviously, we need the consensus, the startup of collecting the data, etc. The project target shows us that the dynamics regarding the context, the type of organization of criminal groups, and the type of firearms used are very important to keep in mind. It indeed shows that we must continue focusing on the many facets of firearms trafficking, such as smuggling of military-grade firearms, but also focus on what might be called lower quality firearms, such as including the converted firearms, which are more easily accessible for lower criminals. If I'm saying this correctly, I can't exactly think about the correct word for a second. We had already the opportunity to have a look at the report of Project Trafficking Target, and this is specifically important as some of the case studies done by the project prove that proliferation of gun availability can lead to an arms race amongst the criminals, leading to an increased rate of gun violence and general sentiments of insecurity among the population. From today's presentation, we have noted down the importance of increasing our knowledge on non-lethal firearms violence. It is true that the extent of this violence is not yet sufficiently known and definitely not sufficiently quantifiable. Therefore, we look forward to the follow-up project, as mentioned by Niels Insight, which aims to develop a live monitoring tool gathering all types of firearms violence. We do hope that the data collected during the project target will constitute a good basis to kickstart its pilot project. We are very invested in this project because it's actually also a specific activity mentioned in the EU Action Plan on Firearms Trafficking, as it is moduled upon a good practice from the Western Balkans. We are very eager to continue the support to support research in this field, as this information will in turn allow us to shape EU policy and legislative work to tackle the challenges in the field. We're very happy to see such a high level of attendance for the conference today. We are very much looking forward to continuing our work together with all of you. Thank you for all the questions raised and for the suggestions regarding further research, which are always interesting for us as well. Many of the topics we are focusing on ourselves and are very much aware of, but it's always nice to get them prioritized again, so we know what to do in the future. Thank you very much for the organization of this conference. We're looking forward to hopefully seeing you all in real life in March in Brussels. And I would say let's continue the good work we're all doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Febe, for giving the insight from the European Commission. And I'm very happy to hear about the initiatives that are being taken to harmonize data collection. It's something that we really see as a very interesting avenue to improve our intelligence picture. And if we can play any role, more than happy to do so, of course. Also, very happy that we have received the confidence from the European Commission to start with Project Insight. Of course, we will build upon the data from targets, because the data that we have collected is very valuable and can be a really good starting point, but we really want to expand that as well. And together with our partners, also analyze the data. So together with TextGain, CIPRI, Small Arms Survey, and University of Leiden, I think we have a really nice collaboration where we can work together, especially since we are also supported by Europol, European firearms experts, and various national police forces. So this collaboration between these different worlds, I think, is a very good activity, and it's something that we really want to encourage anybody to do so. With these words, I'm coming to the end of our webinar. I would like to thank all of the panel members very warmly for their very valuable contributions. I would also like to thank you, the audience, for the many interesting questions that we have received and the The project target report is now available online. As I mentioned, it's on our website. You can find also other research that we have done in recent years on our website. So please go to www.flemishpeaceinstitute.eu. And of course, our institute will continue working on this issue in the coming months, in the coming years. So please keep an eye open on our social media, and I hope to see you soon in real life. But for now, I would like to say thank you and goodbye from Brussels, and hope to see you later. Bye-bye.